Boston, Massachusetts, a city where success and power often make the difference between who receives prompt attention and who must wait. A metropolis where social contrasts become evident even in hospital corridors, where life and death don't distinguish between social classes, though some insist on believing otherwise. In the financial heart of the American healthcare capital stands the imposing glass and steel building that houses the headquarters of Pharma Global, one of the most important pharmaceutical companies in North America. Its logo, a stylized DNA helix in blue tones, shines brightly at the top of the skyscraper, visible from miles around, as a symbol of power and prestige in the competitive pharmaceutical world. On the top floor of this building is the office of Richard Harrison, CEO of Pharma Global USA, a 45-year-old man whose professional trajectory has been as meteoric as it has been relentless. Tall, always impeccably dressed in custom-made suits, with angular features and penetrating gaze, Richard represents the epitome of the successful executive, brilliant, ambitious, and absolutely ruthless when it comes to business. Have you ever wondered if the way you treat people you consider inferior might someday affect your own life, or that of your loved ones? This story will show you how our actions have unexpected consequences, and how those we look down upon might be exactly the people we'll desperately depend on someday. Subscribe now and hit the bell for more stories that will make you reflect on the value of respect and humility in all circumstances of life. That Wednesday morning, Richard arrived at his office at 7:30 sharp as always. His Tesla Model S, fully electric and valued at over $120,000, was parked in his reserved spot in the underground garage. The security guard greeted him with a mixture of respect and fear, while Richard barely responded with a brief nod. In the private elevator that took him directly to the executive floor, Richard was already reviewing the first emails on his latest generation smartphone. His expression remained impassive as he read reports, proposals, and meeting requests. By the time the elevator doors opened on the 30th floor, he had already made 3 important decisions and rejected 2 proposals he considered insufficient. His personal assistant, Jessica Davis, was waiting for him with a coffee exactly how he liked it, Americano with a splash of almond milk, no sugar, at the perfect temperature. At 38, Jessica was probably the person who had best survived working directly with Richard. Her impeccable efficiency, absolute discretion, and ability to anticipate her boss's needs had made her an indispensable figure in the company. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," she greeted professionally as she handed him the coffee and a tablet with the day's schedule. "The video conference with Berlin is confirmed for 9 Tukis. The development team has sent the preliminary results of the XP290 clinical trial, and Dr. Reynolds requests an urgent meeting to discuss them." Richard took the coffee and tablet without looking directly at her. "Urgent? How urgent?" According to her email, they've detected some unexpected adverse reactions in a small percentage of patients. Nothing serious, but enough to need a protocol review. The XP290 was Pharma Global's new star drug, an innovative treatment for certain autoimmune diseases that promised to revolutionize the market and generate billions in profits. Any delay in its approval and commercialization would mean considerable losses. Richard frowned. "Schedule the meeting for 11, and tell Reynolds I expect solutions, not just problems." "Of course, sir," replied Jessica, accustomed to her boss's sharp tone. As he walked toward his office, Richard crossed paths with several employees who immediately straightened their posture and forced tense smiles. Some murmured greetings that he barely acknowledged with a vague gesture. It was no secret at Pharma Global that the CEO had no time for unnecessary courtesies or trivial conversations. At precisely 9 Hein, Richard connected for the video conference with the executives from the German headquarters. During the next hour, he displayed all his professional charm, his command of the data, and his strategic vision. It was one of his talents. He could be absolutely charming when the situation required it, especially with superiors or important partners. The meeting ended with favorable agreements and congratulations on the progress of the XP290. No one mentioned the potential complications that Dr. Reynolds had detected. Richard had made sure that information didn't reach headquarters until they had a plan to fix it. At 11, Dr. Sarah Reynolds, director of the Clinical Research Department, entered Richard's office. At 42, Sarah was a brilliant scientist with an impressive academic record and several patents to her name. She was probably one of the few people in the company who didn't tremble in Richard's presence, perhaps because her primary motivation was scientific integrity, not corporate advancement. "Good morning, Richard," she greeted professionally, but without the deference that most showed. "Thank you for granting me this meeting on such short notice." Richard nodded briefly. "Jessica mentioned problems with the XP290. I hope they're manageable, Sarah. We have a lot invested in that product." Sarah took a seat in front of the imposing oak and glass desk, placing a tablet in front of her. "We've detected adverse reactions in 3.2% of patients in the trial, primarily liver effects, and in some cases, neurological reactions." 3.2%. "That's within the acceptable margin for this type of medication," Richard replied impatiently. "The rate is acceptable, yes, but the severity of some reactions is not," countered Sarah. 2 patients developed acute liver failure requiring hospitalization. Richard leaned back in his Italian leather chair, assessing the situation. "What's your recommendation?" "We need to modify the protocol, conduct additional tests, and possibly reformulate certain components of the drug," explained Sarah. "This would delay the launch by at least 6 months." 6 months? Richard nearly jumped from his seat. "That's unacceptable, Sarah. The board expects the XP290 to be on the market by next quarter. We've made promises to investors, financial projections based on that date." "I understand the commercial implications, Richard, but we're talking about patient safety," Sarah replied firmly. "We can't ignore this data just to meet an arbitrary deadline." Richard stood up and walked to the window that offered a panoramic view of Boston. He remained silent for a moment, evaluating his options. "What if," he finally said, "we limit the use of the drug to patients without a history of liver problems? That would reduce the risk and allow us to maintain the schedule." Sarah frowned. "We could do that, but we'd still have the problem of neurological reactions, which seem independent of prior liver condition. The benefits of XP290 far outweigh these risks, Sarah," insisted Richard, turning toward her. "We're talking about a drug that will improve the quality of life for millions of people with autoimmune diseases. Are we going to delay that for a handful of adverse cases?" The tension in the room was palpable. Sarah knew she was at one of those ethical crossroads that defined careers and, more importantly, affected lives. "I propose a middle ground," she finally said. "We continue with the planned schedule, but implement a more comprehensive follow-up protocol with weekly liver tests during the first 2 months of treatment, and we continue researching for a possible reformulation in the second generation of the drug." Richard considered the proposal. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than a 6-month delay. "Agreed," he finally conceded. "But I want it to be clear in the reports that the benefits vastly outweigh the risks. And I need you personally to defend this position before the regulatory agencies." Sarah nodded, though something in her expression suggested she wasn't completely comfortable with the compromise. "I'll prepare the modified reports for this afternoon." When Sarah left, Richard sat back at his desk, satisfied with the outcome of the meeting. He had managed to maintain the XP290 schedule without major modifications, which meant that the financial projections would remain intact. The board would be pleased, and his annual bonus, which largely depended on the successful launch of this drug, was assured. The rest of the day passed normally. Meetings, calls, strategic decisions. At 7:30 in the evening, when most employees had already left, Richard received a call from his wife, Amanda. "Richard," Amanda's voice sounded tense, worried. "Can you talk?" "I'm finishing some things," he replied, typing while speaking. "What's going on?" "It's Ethan," she said, referring to their 12-year-old son. "He's had a high fever since this afternoon, and now he's started with a strange rash on his chest and back. I'm worried." Richard stopped typing. Ethan, his only child, was his weakness, though he rarely showed it publicly. "How high is the fever?" 103 degrees Celsius, replied Amanda. "I've given him Tylenol, but it's barely gone down, and the rash worries me. It doesn't look like a simple viral rash." "Have you called the pediatrician?" "Yes, but she's away. Her substitute recommended we go to the ER if the fever doesn't go down in the next few hours, or if the rash spreads. And it's spreading, Richard." Richard looked at his watch. He had a dinner scheduled with Japanese investors at 9:00. "Okay, I'm heading home. If necessary, we'll take him to Massachusetts General." Massachusetts General Hospital was one of the most prestigious private hospitals in Boston, where Pharma Global had a preferred agreement and where Richard personally knew several department heads. "I'll be waiting for you," Amanda replied, somewhat relieved. "Please hurry." When Richard arrived at his home, an elegant single-family residence in Brookline, one of Boston's most exclusive neighborhoods, he found Amanda in Ethan's bedroom. The boy was lying in his bed, his face reddened by fever and visibly uncomfortable. "Dad," he murmured weakly when he saw his father enter. "Hi, champ," Richard greeted, approaching the bed and placing a hand on his son's forehead. It was burning hot. "How are you feeling?" "Everything hurts," replied Ethan, "and my skin itches." Richard exchanged a worried look with Amanda, who slightly lifted the boy's pajama top to show him the rash. It was an irregular pattern of red spots spreading across his chest and up toward his neck. "It's gotten worse in the last hour," explained Amanda, "and now he says his joints hurt." Richard needed no more information. "Let's go to the hospital right now." In less than 10 minutes they had settled Ethan in the back seat of the Tesla, wrapped in a blanket despite the June heat, as the boy had begun to have chills. Richard drove while Amanda, sitting next to her son, monitored his temperature with an app on her smartphone connected to a state-of-the-art thermometer. 103.6 degrees as of now, she reported with growing concern. "It's going up again." Richard stepped on the accelerator, consciously ignoring some speed limits. In normal situations he was a meticulous driver, but concern for his son was altering his usual behavior patterns. They arrived at Massachusetts General Hospital in record time. Richard parked in an area reserved for doctors, deliberately ignoring the signs. At that moment the rules seemed irrelevant to him. They entered the emergency room with Ethan half walking, half being supported by his parents. The receptionist looked at them with an efficient but not particularly impressed expression. In the ER of an elite hospital, a well-dressed family with a sick child was not an unusual sight. "Good evening. We need our son to be seen immediately," declared Richard with the authoritative tone he used in business meetings. "He has a high fever and a rash that's spreading." The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a badge identifying her as Barbara, nodded and began typing on her computer. "I need the patient's information and his insurance details, please." While Amanda provided the details, Richard impatiently looked around. The emergency waiting room was moderately occupied, with several people waiting their turn. "A doctor will evaluate your son shortly," informed Barbara once the registration was complete. "Please take a seat in the waiting area." "Wait?" Richard frowned. "My son has almost 104 degrees of fever and a rash that could be indicative of something serious. He needs immediate attention." "I understand your concern, sir," replied Barbara professionally, "but all cases are evaluated according to their severity. A nurse will perform the triage shortly." "Do you know who I am?" asked Richard, lowering his voice but intensifying his tone. "I'm Richard Harrison, CEO of Pharma Global. Your hospital has a preferred agreement with our company worth millions of dollars annually." The receptionist maintained her neutral expression. "I understand, Mr. Harrison, but the emergency protocol is the same for all patients. Classification is based solely on medical criteria." Richard was about to insist when a nurse approached with a clipboard in hand. "Ethan Harrison's family." "Yes, that's us," Amanda quickly responded, while holding Ethan, who seemed increasingly weak. "Please come with me for an initial assessment," indicated the nurse, a young man with a kind but professional expression. They were led to a small room where the nurse took Ethan's vital signs and examined the rash. His expression became slightly more serious when he saw the extent of the red spots. "When did the symptoms start?" he asked, while noting the temperature, 103.8 degrees. "The fever started this afternoon around 4, explained Amanda. "The rash appeared about 2 hours later and has been spreading." "Any known allergies? Regular medication?" "No allergies, no medication," answered Amanda. "Has he been exposed to anyone ill recently? Foreign travel?" "Not that we know of," replied Richard, impatient. "Look, my son is clearly very sick. Could you please expedite this and have him seen by a doctor immediately?" The nurse gave him a neutral look. "I'm performing the evaluation according to protocol, sir. This helps us determine the urgency of the case." "The urgency is evident," insisted Richard. "He has almost 104 degrees of fever and a rash that's spreading all over his body. We don't need more evaluations, we need treatment." "I understand your concern," replied the nurse, maintaining his calm. "I'll complete my report, and a doctor will see your son as soon as possible." After completing the evaluation, the nurse led them back to the waiting room, but not before taking a blood sample from Ethan for urgent analysis. "The doctor will call you shortly," he informed before leaving. Richard, Amanda, and Ethan waited in the room. The boy, increasingly weaker, rested his head on his mother's lap while she gently stroked his hair. Richard checked his watch every few minutes, his impatience growing by the moment. 15 minutes later, which seemed like an eternity to Richard, a nurse approached them. She was a woman in her mid-30s with her hair pulled back in a practical bun and a serene expression that conveyed competence. "Harrison family?" she asked. "I'm Megan Taylor, nurse in the pediatric emergency service. If you'll come with me, please, we're going to move Ethan to an examination room." She led them through a hallway to a room equipped with a stretcher, several monitors, and the usual medical instruments. She helped Ethan lie down on the stretcher while connecting a vital signs monitor. "The doctor will be here shortly," she informed while adjusting the monitor. "Meanwhile, I'm going to insert an IV line so we can administer medication and start fluid therapy." "He's somewhat dehydrated from the fever," Richard observed, as the nurse prepared the materials for the IV. Her movements were precise and efficient, but to his liking, too slow given the gravity of the situation. "Shouldn't the doctor be here already?" he asked sharply. "The doctor is attending to an emergency, Mr. Harrison," replied Megan without altering her rhythm. "She'll be here as soon as possible. Meanwhile, I'm going to start the preliminary care that Ethan needs." She approached the boy with the IV materials. "Hi, Ethan," she said in a soft voice. "I'm going to put a small tube in your arm to give you medicines that will make you feel better. It's going to bother you a little, but it will be very quick, okay?" Ethan nodded weakly. The nurse proceeded to search for a suitable vein, but the boy's state of dehydration complicated the task. After a first failed attempt, which made Ethan complain, she tried at another point. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she apologized. "Sometimes it's a bit difficult to find a good vein." The second attempt was also unsuccessful, causing more discomfort to Ethan and increasing his parents' anxiety. "For God's sake," snapped Richard, unable to contain himself any longer. "Can't you do something as basic as inserting an IV? My son is suffering unnecessarily." Megan maintained her calm, though a slight flush appeared on her cheeks. "Dehydration makes venous access difficult, Mr. Harrison. I'm going to try once more, this time with a smaller but more visible vein." "Maybe we should wait for the doctor," suggested Amanda, trying to mediate as she saw the growing tension. "There's no time to wait," replied Megan with professional firmness. "Your son needs fluid therapy right now. Dehydration associated with high fevers can be dangerous, especially in children." She concentrated again on her task, this time aiming for a vein on the back of Ethan's hand. With precision, she managed to insert the needle and secure the IV. "There it is," she said with an encouraging smile toward Ethan. "You've been very brave. Now we're going to connect this IV that will help you feel better." As she hung the IV bag and adjusted the rate of the infusion, Richard watched her with a critical expression. 3 attempts to insert a simple IV, he muttered loudly enough to be heard. "The incompetence of the staff is incredible, even in a supposedly prestigious hospital." Megan visibly tensed but didn't respond. She continued with her work, connecting Ethan to the vital signs monitor and recording the values on an electronic tablet. "His blood pressure is a bit low," she commented, addressing mainly Amanda, who seemed more receptive. "That's consistent with dehydration. The IV will help, and I've also added an antipyretic for the fever." "When will a doctor see my son?" insisted Richard. "We don't need a nurse who can barely insert an IV. We need a specialist who can diagnose and treat whatever is causing these symptoms." Megan's patience finally reached its limit. She turned to Richard, maintaining a professional tone but with a clearly firm edge. "Mr. Harrison, I perfectly understand your concern for your son. It's natural that you're anxious. However, I must point out that derogatory comments towards staff who are trying to help don't benefit anyone, much less Ethan." "It's not anxiety, it's justified indignation," replied Richard. "If everyone in this hospital works at your level of efficiency, it's no wonder patients wait for hours." "Dr. Wilson will be here shortly," replied Megan, choosing not to engage in an argument. "Meanwhile, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to check the preliminary results of the blood tests." She left the room with a firm step, leaving the Harrison family in tense silence. "Richard, please," murmured Amanda once they were alone. "Now is not the time for this. They're attending to Ethan as best they can." "As best they can?" he countered, though lowering his voice so his son wouldn't hear clearly. "That nurse barely seems competent for basic tasks, and a doctor hasn't even appeared yet. It's unacceptable." "Dad," Ethan called weakly from the stretcher. The nurse was nice. "And I feel a little better with the IV." Richard approached his son, softening his expression. "I just want you to receive the best possible care, champ. I promise I'll make sure of it." A few minutes later, the door opened, and a woman in her mid-40s entered, dressed in a white coat over blue surgical scrubs. She carried a tablet and her expression was serious but reassuring. "Good evening. I'm Dr. Rebecca Wilson, head of the Pediatric Emergency Department," she introduced herself. "I apologize for the wait. I was attending to an emergency." She approached Ethan directly. "Hello, Ethan, how are you feeling?" "Bad," replied the boy. "Everything hurts and my skin itches." Dr. Wilson nodded understandingly as she began to examine the rash. "Let's see what's going on here. Do you mind if I examine your skin?" After obtaining Ethan's permission, she conducted a thorough examination, paying special attention to the pattern and distribution of the rash. Her expression became slightly more concentrated. "Have you noticed if the rash started in any specific place before spreading?" she asked the parents. "It started on the chest," replied Amanda. "Then it spread to the back and neck. Now it seems to be going down the arms too." The doctor nodded as she continued her examination, checking the lymph nodes in the neck and armpits, which appeared swollen. She also checked Ethan's throat and ears. "I've reviewed the preliminary results of the blood tests," she finally said. "They show a significant elevation of inflammatory markers and a pattern of white blood cells consistent with an infection. There are also some indicators of mild liver involvement." "What does that mean?" asked Richard, his tone now more contained in the presence of the chief doctor. "It suggests we're dealing with a systemic infection," explained Dr. Wilson. "The pattern of the rash, along with the high fever, joint pain, and laboratory results, makes me suspect a particular syndrome that requires specific treatment." She paused, carefully evaluating her next words. "I'm going to order more specific tests and start with broad-spectrum antibiotics while we wait for the results. I also want to perform an echocardiogram and a chest X-ray." "Echocardiogram?" Amanda's voice reflected her growing concern. "Why does he need a cardiac test?" "It's a preventive measure," replied the doctor, maintaining a reassuring tone. "The condition, I suspect, can, in some cases, temporarily affect the heart. It's important to rule out any complications." "What condition are we talking about exactly, doctor?" asked Richard, his impatience barely contained. Dr. Wilson looked at both of them seriously. "Based on the symptoms and preliminary results, I suspect that Ethan might be developing toxic shock syndrome. It's a serious condition, but treatable if addressed in time." The color drained from Amanda's face. "Toxic shock? But it's very serious, isn't it?" "It can be," confirmed the doctor. "But we've identified the symptoms relatively early, which is crucial for the prognosis. We're going to transfer Ethan to the pediatric ICU for constant monitoring while we start treatment." Richard, momentarily speechless, nodded. The gravity of the situation was finally beginning to penetrate through his usual shield of control and authority. "What is the treatment?" he finally managed to ask. "Specific intravenous antibiotics, support to maintain blood pressure if necessary, and measures to control fever and inflammation," explained the doctor. "We'll also need to identify the source of the infection, which is often a wound or abrasion, though sometimes it's not easily visible." She turned toward the door and called, "Nurse Taylor, please." Megan, the same nurse who had initially attended to Ethan, immediately entered the room. "Megan will coordinate the transfer to the pediatric ICU," explained Dr. Wilson. "She's our specialist in toxic shock cases and serious infectious diseases in children. She has specialized training in these types of conditions and has published several scientific papers on the subject. You'll be in excellent hands." Richard looked at the nurse with poorly disguised surprise. The woman he had treated with such disdain and had called incompetent turned out to be a recognized specialist in precisely what his son needed. Dr. Wilson continued, "Megan will establish the specific treatment protocol once we complete the diagnostic tests. Her experience in similar cases will be invaluable." Megan nodded professionally. "I've already alerted the pediatric ICU team and requested the preparation of the antibiotics we'll likely need, Doctor. I've also coordinated with the laboratory to prioritize the specific tests." "Excellent," approved Dr. Wilson. "I'm going to personally perform the echocardiogram while they prepare the room in the ICU." While the doctor prepared the equipment for the echocardiogram, Megan approached Ethan with a reassuring smile. "We're going to move you to a special room where we can take better care of you, Ethan," she explained in a kind tone, but without condescension. "You'll have some wires connected so we can see how your body is functioning, but they won't hurt you. It's like being an astronaut with sensors, you know?" That comparison drew a weak smile from the boy. "Like in the movies?" "Exactly like in the movies," confirmed Megan. And I'll be with you most of the time, making sure you get better. She turned to Amanda. Mrs. Harrison, one of you will be able to stay with Ethan at all times. The pediatric ICU room has a recliner so you can rest. I'll stay, Amanda immediately replied. Of course, nodded Megan. I suggest you prepare a small bag with essentials to spend the night. Mr. Harrison can bring it to you later. Richard, who had remained unusually silent, finally spoke. What is the prognosis? Will he be okay? The question, formulated with a vulnerability he rarely showed, was directed at both Dr. Wilson and Megan. With adequate and timely treatment, most children recover completely from toxic shock syndrome, replied Megan with professionalism but also compassion. Ethan is receiving very early care, which is extremely favorable. Also, he doesn't seem to have complicating factors like pre-existing diseases. Dr. Wilson, who had finished preparing the equipment, added, Nurse Taylor is right. Time is crucial in these cases, and you acted quickly in bringing him in. That plays in your favor. While the doctor performed the echocardiogram, Richard observed Megan preparing for the transfer, organizing the necessary equipment, and coordinating with the ICU staff through a discreet intercom on her uniform. Her movements were efficient, precise, and conveyed a confidence that sharply contrasted with the impression he had initially formed. The heart looks good for now, Dr. Wilson finally announced, to the parents' relief. There are no signs of pericardial effusion or alterations in contractility. That's excellent news. Everything's ready for the transfer, Doctor, reported Megan. The pediatric ICU is prepared, and the antibiotics are being formulated according to protocol. Perfect, approved Dr. Wilson. I'll accompany you during the transfer, and then I must return to the ER. Megan will take care of Ethan in the ICU, implementing the treatment protocol we've discussed. As an assistant entered with a transport stretcher, Richard suddenly found himself face to face with Megan, while the others were busy carefully transferring Ethan. He began, clearly uncomfortable. I wanted to apologize for my earlier behavior. I didn't know you were a specialist, Megan completed without hostility but also without yielding ground. Mr. Harrison, I appreciate your apology, but my level of specialization shouldn't matter. All healthcare professionals deserve respect, from the aides to the department heads. We are all part of the team caring for your son. Richard, unaccustomed to being corrected, found himself nodding. You're right, of course. My concern doesn't justify my behavior. Concern for a sick child is understandable, replied Megan in a softer tone. But trust us, we'll do everything possible for Ethan. The transfer to the pediatric ICU was carried out efficiently. The room assigned to Ethan was spacious by hospital standards, equipped with state-of-the-art monitors, a recliner for the accompanying person, and decor that tried to be less intimidating for young patients, with colorful murals and some strategically placed superhero figures. Once Ethan was settled and connected to the monitors, Dr. Wilson said goodbye, promising to return first thing in the morning. You're in excellent hands with Megan, she assured the parents. She's the best specialized nurse in cases like this that we have in the hospital. After the doctor's departure, Megan proceeded to administer the first dose of antibiotics, explaining each step to both Ethan and his parents. This is a very powerful antibiotic, she explained, while adjusting the rate of the infusion. It acts directly against the toxins that are causing the symptoms. You might feel some coldness as it enters, Ethan. That's normal. The boy nodded weakly. The fever was still high, but the IV fluids and antipyretics had slightly improved his alertness. I'm also going to apply cold compresses at strategic points to help bring down the fever, continued Megan. And we'll be constantly monitoring your vital signs to make sure everything is evolving correctly. She turned to Richard and Amanda. I suggest that one of you go home to get what's needed for overnight. The treatment process will take time. I'll go, Richard immediately offered. Amanda, what do you need me to bring you? While Amanda listed the essential items, Megan prepared the cold compresses and adjusted the monitoring parameters. Her movements conveyed a confidence that was reassuring to the worried parents. I'll be back as soon as possible, promised Richard, kissing his son's forehead and gently squeezing his wife's hand. Before leaving, he stopped next to Megan, who was reviewing the data on one of the monitors. Thank you, he said simply. Megan nodded with a slight professional smile. It's my job, Mr. Harrison. Take care of your wife while you're out. She needs support too. During the drive home, Richard found himself reflecting on the turn the situation had taken. His son was seriously ill, depending on the expert care of a professional whom he had treated with disdain just a few hours earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him. Upon arriving home, he quickly collected what Amanda had requested: comfortable clothes, basic toiletries, the book she was reading, Ethan's favorite stuffed animal. He also took his own toiletry bag and a change of clothes, deciding that he wouldn't leave his son alone that night, even if he had to sleep in a chair. As he was putting everything into a travel bag, his phone rang. It was Scott Davidson, Pharma Global's CFO, who was probably calling to find out why he had missed the dinner with the Japanese investors. He hesitated a moment before deciding to answer. "Scott, this isn't a good time." "Richard, what happened? The Japanese have been waiting for an hour. They're starting to think it's a sign of disrespect." "My son is in the ICU," Richard replied dryly. "He has toxic shock syndrome. The survival chances are good, but I'm not leaving the hospital to have dinner with investors." There was silence on the other end of the line. "I'm very sorry, Richard. I didn't know. Is there anything I can do?" "Take care of the Japanese. Make something up. Tell them I had a family emergency. Tomorrow I'll try to connect remotely for the presentation, if Ethan's situation allows it." "Don't worry about that now," replied Scott, his tone notably more human than the usual professional exchange. "Focus on your son. I'll handle everything here." Richard briefly thanked him and ended the call. It was the first time in years that he had completely delegated an important negotiation, but at that moment, the potential millions that the Japanese investors represented seemed insignificant compared to his son's health. Upon returning to the hospital, he found Ethan somewhat more comfortable. The fever had gone down slightly, though it was still high, and the rash didn't seem to be spreading further. Megan was adjusting one of the monitors when he entered. "Good news," she reported. "The blood pressure has stabilized, and the first control tests show a slight decrease in inflammatory markers. It's very early to claim victory, but these are positive signs." Amanda, who was holding her son's hand, seemed to have aged years in the last few hours. Fear and worry had left visible marks on her usually serene face. "I've brought everything," said Richard, handing her the bag, "and some things for me too. I'll stay with you tonight." "There's no need," Amanda began. "You have the presentation tomorrow." "To hell with the presentation," interrupted Richard with unusual firmness. "Our son comes first. Scott will take care of the investors." The surprise on Amanda's face was evident. Richard had never put his family above work, not in such an explicit and decisive manner. Megan, who had been checking the medication, intervened discreetly. "The recliner is quite comfortable, Mr. Harrison, but I can request a folding bed if you prefer." Some parents find that taking turns to rest is the best strategy during prolonged hospitalizations. "Thank you," replied Richard with genuine gratitude. "The recliner will be fine for tonight. How long do you think Ethan will be here?" "It's difficult to be precise at this stage," replied Megan honestly. "In cases like this, we generally observe an initial response to treatment within the first 24-48 hours. If the evolution is favorable, as we expect, he could be transferred to a regular ward in about 3 days. The total hospital stay is usually a week to 10 days. "And complete recovery?" asked Amanda. "With the appropriate treatment and without complications, most children recover completely in a few weeks," explained Megan. "Ethan is a previously healthy child, which works in his favor. We'll closely monitor any possible cardiac or renal involvement, but so far his organs seem to be responding well." She approached Ethan, who was dozing slightly, and checked his temperature with an ear thermometer. 101.7 deg. It continues to go down, though slowly. That's a good sign. The night passed with the tension typical of a pediatric ICU. Megan entered regularly to check on Ethan, adjust medications, and check the monitors. Every few hours she performed blood tests to monitor the response to treatment. Despite the constant interruptions, her presence was reassuring to the worried parents. Around 3 in the morning, while Amanda dozed in the recliner and Richard tried to find a comfortable position in a chair next to the bed, Megan entered silently to perform another evaluation. "Mr. Harrison, there's a family rest area at the end of the hall," she whispered. "It has more comfortable chairs and coffee machines. I can alert you immediately if there's any change." Richard shook his head. "I prefer to stay here, thank you." Megan nodded, understanding. "I'm going to check the IVs and take another blood sample. I'll try not to wake him." As she worked with efficient silence, Richard observed her. There was a concentration in her face, a confidence in her movements that conveyed years of experience and specialized knowledge. How long have you been specializing in cases like this? Richard asked quietly, so as not to wake Amanda or disturb Ethan. Megan seemed surprised by the question. About 8 years, she replied as she carefully labeled the tubes with the blood samples. After my basic training as a nurse, I did a specialization in pediatric intensive care and then a master's in infectious diseases. I've worked in hospitals in the UK and Canada before returning to the United States. Why did you choose this particular specialty? Asked Richard, genuinely interested. Megan completed her task before responding. My younger brother had toxic shock syndrome when he was 9. I was 15 then. Seeing how the healthcare professionals saved his life, it changed my perspective on what I wanted to do with mine. Did he recover completely? Megan smiled. Totally. Now he's an aerospace engineer, and I have to say that Ethan reminds me a bit of him. He has that same look of curiosity even when sick. Richard nodded, feeling an unexpected connection with this woman whom he had treated with such disdain hours earlier. It must be gratifying, he commented, to be able to have such an impact on people's lives. It is, confirmed Megan, though we don't always receive the recognition that doctors receive. Many see nurses as mere assistants, when in reality we are highly qualified professionals with our own areas of specialization. The comment, though expressed without direct reproach, made Richard feel alluded to. I've been one of those, haven't I? Underestimating your qualification and experience. Megan looked at him directly. Mr. Harrison, what's important now is Ethan. His recovery is my priority, not initial impressions or apologies. I understand, but still, I want you to know that I regret my earlier behavior. It was disrespectful and completely unjustified. I appreciate your honesty, replied Megan. Now you should try to get some rest. Tomorrow will be another intense day. Megan's prediction proved accurate. The next 24 hours were an emotional roller coaster for the Harrison family. Ethan's condition fluctuated. Moments of apparent improvement, followed by episodes of high fever or worrying drops in his blood pressure. Megan remained a constant presence, adjusting treatments, monitoring responses, anticipating potential complications. Her coordination with the doctors making rounds was impeccable, providing detailed reports and suggesting adjustments to the treatment that were almost always approved. Richard, who had cancelled all his professional commitments to stay at the hospital, observed with growing respect the work of Megan and the rest of the healthcare team. It was a completely different world from his own, where decisions were made based on clinical data and human well-being, not financial projections and shareholder value. By the third day, Ethan's condition began to stabilize more consistently. The fever subsided, the rash began to fade, and the inflammatory markers in his blood showed a significant decrease. I think we've passed the worst, announced Dr. Wilson during the morning visit. The response to treatment is excellent. If it continues like this, tomorrow we might consider transferring him to a regular ward. Megan, who was present during the evaluation, nodded in agreement. The latest tests show a clear positive trend. Renal and liver function is normalizing, and the control echocardiogram shows no cardiac involvement. Does that mean he'll recover completely? Asked Amanda, allowing herself for the first time in days a glimpse of full hope. Everything points in that direction, confirmed Dr. Wilson. Timely treatment and expert care have been crucial. She looked at Megan with evident professional appreciation. Nurse Taylor has implemented the treatment protocol with exceptional precision. Her experience in similar cases has been invaluable. It certainly has been, agreed Richard with sincere gratitude. That afternoon, while Ethan slept peacefully and Amanda had gone home briefly to shower and change, Richard found himself alone with Megan in the room. You look tired, he observed as she updated records on a tablet. How many hours straight have you been working? Megan smiled slightly. I've lost count, to be honest, but don't worry, I'm used to long shifts. Still, your dedication is impressive, commented Richard. You haven't left Ethan's case for a moment. It's my responsibility as a specialist nurse, she replied simply. When I accept a case like this, I commit completely. There was a moment of silence before Richard spoke again. You know, this entire experience has been revealing for me. Megan looked up from her tablet, waiting for him to continue. In my world, that of corporations and business, we measure success in terms of profits, growth, shareholder value. We rarely consider the real human impact of our decisions. And now, asked Megan softly. Now I see things differently, admitted Richard. Seeing how you and your team work, The dedication, the expertise, the direct impact you have on lives like my son's, it makes me question many of my priorities. Megan nodded understandingly. Personal crises often have that effect. They force us to reevaluate what truly matters. At Pharma Global, continued Richard, we're about to launch a new drug, the XP290. There were concerns about potentially serious side effects, but I decided to proceed with the planned schedule to maintain financial projections. He ran a hand through his hair, an unusual gesture of unease for him. Now I can't help but think, what if it were Ethan who suffered those side effects? Would I still consider that risk acceptable for the sake of quarterly profits? That's an important reflection, commented Megan, especially coming from someone in your position with the power to make decisions that affect so many people. I'm going to halt the launch, Richard decided in that moment, at least until we complete additional tests and reformulate if necessary, no matter what it costs or how long it takes. Megan smiled, a genuine smile for the first time since they met. That's a decision that could save lives, Mr. Harrison. Richard, please, he corrected. I think after saving my son's life, we've moved past formalities. Richard, accepted Megan with a nod. And I haven't saved Ethan by myself. It's been a team effort. A team that you've led with exceptional competence, insisted Richard. I'll never forget what you've done for my family, Megan. The next day brought the expected good news. Ethan was ready to be transferred to a regular room on the pediatric ward. His recovery was progressing steadily, and he no longer needed the intensive monitoring of the ICU. I'll continue to supervise his case, even though he's on the ward, Megan assured the parents as they prepared for the transfer. I'll visit him daily and coordinate with the ward nursing team to ensure continuity of care. I don't know how to thank you enough, said Amanda, impulsively taking Megan's hands in hers. You've been our guardian angel these days. I've just done my job, replied Megan, though clearly moved by the gesture. And it's been a pleasure to meet Ethan. He's an extraordinary child. She turned to the boy, who was sitting on the bed, now without most of the monitors and with a much healthier color in his cheeks. Ready for your new room, champ? I've heard it has a TV and a great view of the garden. Ethan nodded enthusiastically. Will you come to see me? Every day, promised Megan. We have to make sure you continue improving. And maybe I can bring you some superhero comics. I've heard you like them. Once the transfer was completed and Ethan comfortably settled in his new room, Megan temporarily said goodbye to attend to other patients in the ICU. Richard accompanied her to the hallway. May I speak with you for a moment? He asked. Of course, replied Megan, stopping. I wanted to inform you that this morning I spoke with my team at Pharma Global. We've decided to halt the launch of the XP290 to conduct additional tests and a possible reformulation. Patient safety must be our absolute priority, not commercial deadlines. Megan nodded with approval. That's a brave and ethical decision. Not all pharmaceutical companies would put safety above short-term profits. I've also been thinking, continued Richard, about how we could improve collaboration between Pharma Global and frontline healthcare professionals like you. We often develop medications based on data and studies, but we lose the perspective of those who actually treat patients day to day. That would be extremely valuable, agreed Megan. Nursing professionals, in particular, have a unique perspective on how treatments affect patients in the real world, beyond controlled clinical trials. I'd like to invite you to be part of an advisory committee that I'm planning to create, proposed Richard. A multidisciplinary group of healthcare professionals that brings that practical perspective to our development processes. Your experience in infectious diseases and critical care would be extremely valuable. Megan seemed genuinely surprised by the offer. It's an interesting proposal, and potentially very beneficial for patients. I'd like to know more details when you have the approach more defined. Of course, nodded Richard. I'll send you a formal proposal once Ethan is fully recovered. They said goodbye with a handshake that symbolized something more than a professional interaction. It was the mutual recognition of two people dedicated to their respective fields, who had found common ground in caring for and responsibility toward others. The following days brought steady improvement in Ethan's condition. Antibiotic treatment continued, but the boy rapidly regained his strength and characteristic good humor. Megan, true to her word, visited him daily, often bringing comics or small gifts that made his time in the hospital more bearable. A week after admission, Dr. Wilson informed the Harrisons that Ethan could be discharged in 2 days if he continued to evolve favorably. He'll have to continue the antibiotic treatment at home for another week, she explained, and will do weekly checkups during the first month, but all indicators suggest a complete recovery without sequelae. The news was received with relief and joy by the whole family. That afternoon, while Ethan took a nap and Amanda had gone to the cafeteria, Richard found himself alone with Megan again during one of her routine visits. "I have something for you," he said, handing her an envelope. "It's a draft of the approach for the advisory committee we discussed. I'd like to know your opinion before officially presenting it to the board of directors." Megan took the envelope with interest. "I'll review it tonight. It's an important step toward more meaningful collaboration between industry and healthcare professionals. I've also included a proposal to establish a specific research fund for emerging infectious diseases," added Richard. "I believe it's an area that needs more attention and resources." "I'm impressed," admitted Megan. "This experience seems to have affected you deeply." "It has," confirmed Richard. "Seeing my son in danger, completely depending on the expertise and dedication of people like you, it has changed my perspective on many things. It's made me realize that the true impact of our work isn't measured in dollars or stock valuation, but in human lives improved or saved." He paused before continuing, "But I've also learned something more personal, the importance of treating all people with respect, regardless of their title or apparent position. We never know who might be crucial in the most important moments of our lives." Megan nodded understandingly. "It's a valuable lesson, and one that unfortunately many people in positions of power never come to learn." "I've been lucky to learn it before it was too late," reflected Richard, "both for my son and for my own humanity." The conversation was interrupted by Ethan's awakening, who smiled widely upon seeing Megan. "You came!" he exclaimed with childlike enthusiasm. "As I do every day," she replied, approaching the bed. "And you know what? Today I've brought something special." She took out of her pocket a small pocket microscope, the kind children use for basic explorations. "Your father told me you're interested in science. I thought this might entertain you during the days you have left here." Ethan's eyes lit up as he took the gift. "Cool. Thanks, Megan." Richard observed the interaction with a smile. It was amazing how someone he had initially considered a mere incompetent nurse had become such a significant figure in his family's life. 2 days later, as promised by Dr. Wilson, Ethan was discharged from the hospital. He was remarkably recovered, though he would still need follow-up and medication for a few weeks. The Harrison family was preparing to leave when Megan appeared for a final visit. "I've come to say goodbye," she announced with a smile. "Though we'll see each other at the weekly checkups, of course." "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done," said Amanda, spontaneously hugging her. "Seeing Ethan recovered is all the thanks I need," replied Megan, clearly moved by the gesture. She approached the boy who was sitting in a wheelchair, hospital protocol for discharges, though he could now walk without problems. "Ready to go home, scientist?" Ethan nodded enthusiastically, showing her the microscope he carried in his pocket. "I've been looking at everything. Hair, skin, even an ant I found on the windowsill." "A true researcher," approved Megan with a smile. "Remember that you have to keep taking your medicines exactly as they've explained to you, okay? It's very important." "I promise," Ethan assured solemnly. Megan turned to Richard, extending her hand. "It's been a pleasure to meet you despite the circumstances, and I'm impressed with the proposals you sent me. I think they could have a significant impact on how new treatments are developed." Richard took her hand, but instead of a simple handshake, he covered it with his other hand in a gesture of sincere gratitude. "The pleasure has been mine, Megan, and this is just the beginning. I hope our professional collaboration will be long and fruitful." "So do I," she agreed. As the Harrison family left the hospital, with Ethan enthusiastically waving from his wheelchair, Richard reflected on the extraordinary turns his life had taken in just 10 days. He had entered that hospital as an arrogant executive, convinced of his own importance and dismissive of those he considered inferior in the social or professional hierarchy. He was leaving as a transformed man, with a new appreciation for the real value of each person's work, regardless of their title, and with a deeper understanding of his own responsibilities, both personal and professional. In the car, as they drove back home, Amanda noticed his unusual silence. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. Richard smiled, briefly glancing at Ethan through the rearview mirror. The boy was absorbed in examining something with his microscope, oblivious to his parents' conversation. "I was thinking about how close we came to losing him," he replied honestly, "and how a person I treated with such inconsideration turned out to be exactly who we needed in our most vulnerable moment. Megan is extraordinary, agreed Amanda. Everyone at the hospital spoke of her with such respect. She's a true authority in her field, and I judged her in seconds based solely on her uniform, reflected Richard with regret. I wonder how many other people I've underestimated or dismissed throughout my career, people with valuable talents and knowledge who could have contributed much if I had had the humility to listen. What's important is that you've learned, consoled Amanda, placing a hand on his. I've seen you change during these days, Richard. The way you spoke with the hospital staff, how you prioritized family over work. It's as if you finally found a balance. Richard nodded, gently squeezing his wife's hand. A balance I should have sought long ago, but it's never too late to change course. Upon arriving home, as he helped his son settle comfortably on the sofa for a quiet afternoon of recovery, Richard made a decision. The experience lived wouldn't be just an emotional anecdote to tell at some dinner, or even just the catalyst for some changes at Pharma Global. It would be the beginning of a deeper transformation in his way of leading, of relating to others, and of evaluating the true value of each person and each contribution, because he had learned, in the hardest way possible, that competence, knowledge, and dedication don't always come with the most prestigious titles or the highest positions, and that the person we dismiss today might be exactly who saves what we love most tomorrow. 3 months later, Pharma Global officially announced the creation of a frontline healthcare professionals advisory committee with Megan Taylor as one of its main coordinators. The launch of the XP290 had been postponed to allow for additional testing and a reformulation that eliminated the identified risks, a decision that, surprisingly, was well received by investors as a demonstration of the company's commitment to patient safety. In his speech during the official presentation of the committee, Richard Harrison surprised many with his words. For years, at Pharma Global and throughout the pharmaceutical industry, we have operated under the belief that knowledge flows primarily from top to bottom, from research laboratories and boards of directors to healthcare professionals, and finally, to patients. Today we recognize that this model is fundamentally incomplete. He paused, scanning the diverse group of healthcare professionals that made up the new committee. True knowledge about how our medications impact human lives resides in those who are on the front lines. Specialist nurses like Megan Taylor, who see the clinical reality day after day, primary care doctors who know their patients as people, not as statistical data, hospital pharmacists who observe interactions and side effects in real time. This committee, he continued, is not a public relations exercise or a regulatory formality. It's a sincere recognition that we need to listen more and assume less, collaborate more and direct less. It's a commitment to a new model of pharmaceutical development, one that puts lived experience and direct clinical observation on the same level as laboratory data and financial analyses. Among the attendees, Amanda and Ethan, now fully recovered, applauded enthusiastically. The boy, who had developed a fascination with microbiology as a result of his experience and the microscope gifted by Megan, observed everything with eyes bright with admiration for his father. After the official ceremony, Richard approached Megan, who was conversing with other committee members. "An impressive speech," she commented when she saw him approach, "and more importantly, it seems genuinely sincere." "It is," confirmed Richard. "Every word." "The real test, of course, will be how these ideas are implemented in Pharma Global's daily practice," added Megan, with her characteristic frankness. "Inspiring words are a good start, but concrete actions and structural changes are needed," completed Richard. "You're absolutely right. And that's why I've included in the committee's bylaws veto power over any launch if there are unresolved safety concerns. Profitability will never again be above patient safety." Megan seemed genuinely impressed. "That's unusually progressive for a pharmaceutical company of this size." "Let's say I had a transformative experience," replied Richard with a smile. "One that taught me that sometimes the person you least value can be exactly who saves what you love most." He looked toward where Ethan was playing with other children, healthy, happy, full of energy and curiosity. "And that's a lesson I'll never forget." Megan followed his gaze toward Ethan and smiled. "It's been worth it just to see that smile again." "And for many more smiles we don't yet know," added Richard. "Those of all the patients who will benefit from safer and more effective medications thanks to this new way of working together." As the reception continued around them, with pharmaceutical executives and healthcare professionals conversing in a genuine exchange of perspectives, Richard reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun that night in the emergency room when he had treated with disdain a simple nurse who turned out to be his son's salvation. The lesson was clear. Each person deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because we never know when our lives might depend on them. And in an increasingly interconnected and complex world, our survival, both individual and collective, depends precisely on valuing all forms of knowledge, experience, and dedication wherever they come from. Have you ever found yourself judging someone based only on their appearance or title? Have you treated people in service professions with disdain, without considering the experience or knowledge they might have? This story reminds us that respect should be universal, and that arrogance can blind us to those who might be our salvation in times of true need. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more content that will make you reflect on the value of respect and humility in all circumstances of life. Sharing this story could help someone recognize the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their position or title.